Cold Case, An Angelica Dale Mystery by P.K. Armstrong. Chapter 6. I used a two-lane highway for most of my journey to Osgood. I began at 4 a.m. and still relied on my headlights to light up the narrow curve ahead. A car, headed in the opposite direction, appeared and, true to country manners, dimmed its high beams as I exited the curve in the road and faced it head on. The music was on low, a hushed background to my thoughts. With the receipt of most of the police case file from Christopher, I had decided I could start my trip to Osgood earlier than I had planned. I smiled to myself, thinking of Violet's reaction to my trip. I'm not sure how long I will be gone, but I won't be far away, just an hour and a half north from here. Violet's dismay registered on her face.
Why can't I come with you?
Violet, you are in school. You can't miss. Violet sighed. She loved school and was torn between missing school and missing me. Her next words, however, were a shock.
So I'm going to stay with Christopher while you're gone?
My mouth dropped open and I couldn't speak. Finally, I ventured a question. Well, I had thought you would stay with Francine and Jerry. Do you not want to stay with them?
I love staying with Francine and Jerry, but I've never stayed with Christopher before.
She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes.
And he doesn't stay with us.
It was a statement, but somehow the look on Violet's face made it accusatory. After a quiet discussion, I had finally convinced Violet that my mom and dad would feel slighted if she didn't stay with them, and promised that she would see Christopher as much as he could manage with work. Christopher was an important part of Violet's life. He was the police investigator who handled her assault case over 3 years ago, and as he and I began dating, he was the first man who she allowed to get close, besides my father. Christopher was patient with her, never forcing her to feel a closeness that didn't come naturally to her. His care and concern for her was one of the things that attracted me to him. The sun was making an appearance, the morning dew burning off slowly, and the few remaining damp spots on the road glistened in the light. Glancing at the clock, I estimated I had another 45 minutes on the road. It was confirmed by a battered mile marker sign still in the dark and spotlighted by a single dingy light, a light bravely shining on despite its fellows being long extinguished by rusted parts and broken bulbs. I contemplated stopping at the next gas stop just to drink my coffee. Two-lane highways were the gateway to the country, but were notorious for deer or other nocturnal animals jumping into the path of oncoming cars, probably due to the headlights or road sounds causing confusion. When my dad taught me to drive, he doggedly drummed into me the need to keep both hands on the steering wheel. I made my decision and pulled into the next stop. After a brief trip to the restroom, I opened my tailgate and sat drinking my coffee and eating a buttery croissant with cheese. It was still early, so the traffic passing the gas station was minimal, and I relaxed. Slowly, the country symphony emerged, the birds chirping, the cool morning wind rustling trees, and from somewhere nearby, the sounds of a brook splashing over rocks. I thought about my task ahead. I won't try to obfuscate. It would have been nice to have Christopher by my side. It would make the reintroduction to his family easier. We visited after Christopher had been injured after my last case and had spent a long weekend with them. Even more so, it would have been nice to have his sharp investigative mind on this cold case. Anyone who worked cold cases and cleared them had always been top class for me. The obstacles of cold cases often deterred lesser mortals. Even if the physical evidence in the case was still stored with the investigative agency, depending on the length of time, the witnesses could be dead or the validity of their memories questioned. I had already made a few calls and discovered both of the lead detectives were dead, and Osgood PD only kept evidence for 7 years after a trial in case of appeals or civil litigation. Once I arrived at Osgood, I would be starting from scratch on a 40-year-old case. I could definitely use Christopher on this one. I finished my scratch meal as the sun came up, got behind the wheel of my car, and finished the final 20 miles of my journey. Osgood sat in a slight valley on the edge of a confluence surrounded by a forest and rocky hills. I descended the final hill, and a city of gold appeared as the sun's rays gave it a glowing halo, inviting me within its gates. I was a little nervous about what I would find there. Osgood's makeup was like many small towns. Families that had existed in the area for a century formed banks that were eventually bought out by larger national financial institutions in the 90s. The schools were traditional, although small charters had begun forming in the early 2000s. Small industrial businesses formed in the area over 50 years ago, and they drew people looking for jobs, which resulted in those businesses growing. Metal fabrication, food processing plants, and automotive builders were now the foundation of a flourishing economy. I used River's End Road to skirt town and made my way through a quiet upper middle class neighborhood. Sandy said she would expect me early, and I did not disappoint, pulling into the drive of the Roland family home at 6 a.m. Despite my nerves, I smiled as she came out onto the porch and waved. Sandy was tall, 5'8", in her stockinged feet, and although she was only a year away from retirement, she was still a beautiful woman with the health and vibrancy of a woman 20 years her junior. She spurned hair color, and her natural gray highlights shone and framed a face with a clear complexion and bright, inquisitive eyes. The only wrinkles she had were laugh lines she proudly attributed to a husband who kept humor in their lives and the chaos that ensued from raising 3 rambunctious boys. As I approached the porch, I could see she was dressed in a classy rose knit two-piece with fluffy pink house shoes. Angel, how wonderful to see you again, she said with genuine warmth. She enveloped me in a hug, squeezing me gently. I'm so glad you are here, she said quietly in my ear. I hugged her back. I'm so glad you asked me to help. Come in, come in. The boys are having their breakfast. Sandy drew me up the steps and into her home. The Roland home was more modern than my own parents' home and larger. The traditional meets contemporary home had 5 bedrooms and 5.5 bathrooms. The neutral color was accented with wooden beams leading to vaulted ceilings. I stepped in the foyer and paused to sniff appreciatively at the smell of coffee and bacon. Sandy smiled widely. Come say hi. She led me down the hallway into an open kitchen where her husband and 2 other sons sat, making serious inroads into eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast. Charles, Chuck, Roland, was a large, good-looking man. He told me when I first met him that he saw Sandy from the back first, and his interest was immediately piqued, because she had a nice behind and matched him in size. He said when she turned around and he saw how beautiful she was, he was a goner. Besides, he had continued, any woman that was going to put up with him and his progeny should be physically able to bash a few heads when stupid reared its ugly head. Chuck sat at the end of the table and upon seeing me started to get up. I motioned for him to stay seated. Please don't get up. If I would have thought, I would have arranged to arrive later. I've interrupted your breakfast. Daniel Roland, second after Christopher, responded with a mischievous look in his eye. No, don't be offended, Mom. I'm quite sure she didn't mean to admit that she was avoiding your cooking. Jacob, the youngest, chimed in. Yeah, don't worry, Angel. It's actually pretty good this morning. She didn't burn the bacon like she usually does. Chuck reached up and playfully popped both boys in the head, chuckling. Punks, show some manners. Say hello before you start in on people. Both rubbed their heads, grinned, and said hello. Sandy, are you getting another plate? He said, and then glancing at me, sit and have some breakfast. Thank you. I just had something about 45 minutes ago. Well, sit and have some more coffee. Sandy put a mug and cream and sugar at the empty place next to Jacob. How was your drive in? He asked after she took a sip. Good. I started at 4 a.m. Daniel let out a slow whistle. That's way too early. It's only 90 miles. I laughed at his shock. Well, I knew I would want to stop and take a break, and besides, I had a lot to think about. Not to mention, it's a beautiful country to drive through. That it is, but dangerous. I hope you keep both hands to the wheel. I laughed as Daniel and Jacob made snorting noises and rolled their eyes. I ignored them and answered solemnly, Yep, just like my dad taught me. Chuck nodded and took another bite of toast. So Sandy said you are going to look into the Stormy Giles case? Do you think you can solve it, even after so much time? Jacob was Christopher's youngest brother, and he was absolutely gorgeous. He too had his mother's complexion, but his father's honey-colored eyes. The sides and back of his head were shaved, with dark, curly, medium-length hair on top. The fact that he was an artist made his bearing romantic, and according to Christopher, popular with the girls. He and Christopher had similar hands, not overly large, with long fingers, which, when he moved, were graceful, and made anything he did with them look like a dance. I shrugged. Most likely, no. But with cold cases, sometimes it's enough to disprove a popular theory or rule people out. Specifically in this case, ruling out Stormy Giles may be what she needs to live out her life healthy and content. So ruling someone out is easier than finding the real culprit? Jacob asked, truly interested. I shook my head. No, usually it's harder because you can't always prove a negative. Jacob's face told me he was running scenarios in his head. So where will you begin? Daniel entered the conversation. It's not like you can go and take a look at the crime scene. Chuck grunted in agreement, nodded, and put his coffee cup down on the table. The site was knocked down after the investigation. It was located at the edge of an industrial area. A little over a year after the fire, a large office park was built. I nodded at the information and hid a smile. Chuck Roland's 30 years of government employment happened to be with Osgood's Public Works Department. Christopher once told me that his dad had more knowledge of the city than most of the cops. So what will you do since you can't visit the scene of the crime? Daniel asked again. I smiled at him. While Christopher had his dad's good looks, Daniel was clearly his mother's child. He too was extremely good looking. He wasn't as tall as Christopher and wore his hair slightly longer. His eyes were clear like a small child, and his logical intuitiveness played on his features, making him appear so alive. He had a strong jawline and wore more facial hair. His quiet demeanor gave him a mysterious air, which was a bit contrary to his true nature, as he was the computer wizard of the family, and, once he warmed to you, presented with an open friendliness that attracted most people. I looked at Daniel, who, like his brother, showed real interest in my answer. Well, Christopher has paved the way to the PD. Although they don't keep actual evidence beyond destruction protocol, they did put the crime scene photos on microfiche as sort of a historical canon of crime in Osgood. I have an appointment tomorrow morning to meet with the police archivist. Jacob grinned. His voice dropped, but not too low so everyone could still hear. So what exactly did my big brother get in return for this introduction to the police department? He said with a suggestive wink. The other three Rolands yelled, Jacob! Chuck punctuated his with another pop to Jacob's head. Sandy looked embarrassed, but before she could speak, I answered, No, don't apologize for him. I held up my hand. See, she knows I was joking, Jacob shouted. It was inappropriate, Jacob, Sandy said. She's right. You should make your own apology. Actually, I was thinking you could apologize to your brother later. I gave him my butter wouldn't melt in my mouth smile. No. Jacob threw up both hands. I'm sorry for being a jerk. he said quickly. Please don't tell Chris. He paused and looked at me sheepishly. He'll put me in a headlock, he whispered. I laughed and glanced around the table to reassure myself I did the right thing. You know, Daniel said thoughtfully, for being an only child, you sure do know how to play the sibling game. Jacob, redeem yourself. Bring Angel's bags in and take them to the guest room, Chuck commanded, and Jacob quickly got up to do what he was told. I looked at Sandy, my face frozen. No, well, I hadn't planned to stay here. I'll be coming and going, and I don't want to disturb your routines. I looked around the table at them all, and they all returned my look with an eye roll. Where did you think you were going to stay? At an Airbnb or a hotel? Sandy asked frankly. You can't work a case and review evidence at an Airbnb. You will need a little privacy. And I have fixed up the perfect spot for you. Let's take a look at it first. I opened my mouth to make another effort at resisting, but Chuck and then Daniel both gave me a look that I could only interpret to mean resistance is futile, and closed my mouth. Sandy showed me to a small room just off the kitchen, across from the laundry room. It was about 5 by 5 by 7 and was more nook than room. A built-in desk was at the end of the area, with shelves beginning about 12 inches above its surface. There was a small window facing east, which, according to Sandy, let in pleasant morning sun. Opposite of the window, they had hung a board that almost took up the wall in its entirety. I had seen Christopher use something similar when laying out a tricky case. I think that will come in really handy. I pointed to the board. The chair looked comfortable and didn't crowd out the small space. Sandy watched me as I surveyed the alcove. There are plenty of plugins and the Wi-Fi is great back here. It's great having an IT guy living in the house. Let Daniel know if you have any problems. Do you like it? I smiled at her. I love it. Please tell me you didn't set this up just for me. I was beginning to feel like more trouble than I felt I was worth. Sandy must have noticed my discomfort and stepped in, put an arm around my shoulders, and gave me a squeeze. Don't you worry. We used it for storage, but I always wanted to do this, she motioned with her hand. Your visit just gave me the push I required, and everyone helped. It didn't take long. Lying in bed the first night, I thought of my welcome. I don't know why I was nervous. Christopher's family was welcoming to me and Violet when we visited earlier, so I really had no reason to be. Sandy was right. It would be better to be private. I wouldn't have to worry about strangers seeing what I was doing. Before I went to bed, Chuck reassured me that Christopher had insisted they all keep their mouths shut about someone looking into the case, as it could be damaging in such a small town. I settled into my pillows and sighed. This case was going to require a lot of organization and effort. My first steps would be to get as much as I could from the archives and pull my list of interested parties to see if any of them were still around and would possibly be willing to talk. I knew after some 40+ years, the chances for witnesses would be slim to none, and those I did discover probably wouldn't be too happy about me dredging up painful memories. The foremost of these would be Stormie Gyles. Not only would I have to bring up the past, but I might be giving her false hopes. I would have to tread carefully. Having Christopher's family around me would be good support, and now that I had a moment to think about it, realized Christopher had probably arranged with his mom for me to stay. As I drifted into restful sleep, I thought how Christopher had inherited his dad's good looks and grinned to myself as I realized it was nice to know what he was going to look like in 30 years.